You know the expression, civility costs nothing but buys everything. Well, it doesn't seem to buy modern political discourse. Twitter, bloviating talking heads, and vicious attack ads seem to have stripped civil and constructive discourse from the political sphere, especially south of the border. How did we get here anyway? Well, here's Mark Kingwell. He's the author of Unruly Voices, and we welcome you back to TVO.
Hi, Steve. Glad to be back.
1995, you wrote your first book, I guess, A Civil Tongue, and you looked at the importance of civility in politics. And I just wonder, 17 years later, whether we're better off, worse off, about the same? What do you think?
Well, somewhat incredibly, politicians failed to heed the argument that I made in that book.
I don't believe it.
It's unbelievable, really. I think we are demonstrably worse off in all the kinds of things that you mentioned, especially attack ads and combative punditry, talk radio. One has to be conscious of not falling into what I sometimes think of as the fogey fallacy, which is things were always better in the old days.
But sometimes they really were.
And sometimes they really were. In this case, I think you can really trace breakdowns of democratic process and certainly of discourse in the public sphere over the course of those couple of decades and more. I mean, there's a downward trend that probably starts somewhere in the 1960s.
You know, some people call them attack ads, other people call them contrast ads, which doesn't sound as bad. How do you know the difference?
Well, for me, it's a gut feeling that I have when I'm watching something, and I feel that the ad is not interested in making a point, but rather in tearing someone down. So that sense you immediately get of something that, even if it's phrased in the form of claims and statistics and arguments, that it's ad hominem, that it's about the person rather than the issues. And unfortunately, the standard defense of such ads is that they work. And I always get this kind of hollowed out feeling when I hear people say, oh, they work, because lots of things that work are not okay. You know, it works to eliminate your competitors by murdering them if you don't get caught. That's not okay.
No, but that's against the law.
Yeah,
running
that's true.
Running a nasty ad is not against the law.
I'm not talking about the law. I'm talking about things that are okay.
Right. Okay. No, fair enough.
But and you actually touch on something important, because there are very few policy levers that you can apply when it comes to this part of political life, because you're talking about the culture of a political society, of its processes of democracy, its relationship of its electorate to its politicians, and so on. These are not things that are open to the kinds of regulation and control that we would apply in other areas like the economy or crime.
Let me do one more follow on that, though. Could you not argue that there are some candidates who are running for office, and we've seen some in this campaign, who are really so personally reprehensible, they deserve to be the focus of an attack ad describing them as a piece of garbage?
I don't think that is something that I would ever sanction. Even someone who personally I find repulsive, like Newt Gingrich. I think the point of, to take down a Newt Gingrich, you don't need to attack him. You just need to lay out the facts, that he was a mediocre professor of history, and yet now he constantly sounds the voice of historical reason by his lights, or that he has hypocritically done things with respect to policies on women, even while claiming, to be a representative of family values, and so on and so on. I think these kinds of, if that's the kind of contrastive force, those things are perfectly within the ballpark of reasonable discourse. And you just lay those kinds of arguments out and people can make up their own minds. That's the way it should be done.
Tell us what the advantage of reasonable discourse over, I really need to hit you on the head with the bluntness of this because you lead a busy life, and if I don't get your attention for that 30 seconds, I can't really make my point.
Yeah, well, everything we know about advertising shows that it plays to imagination and emotions rather than to reason. And insofar as there is advertising as part of the political process, that's not going to change. I don't think that even should we decide that discourse is important to us, we would want to have it, as it were, in every corner of political life. Sometimes you need a good shout to get attention. And I picked this phrase, unruly voices, for the title, not to say that all voices are unruly, or that's the problem. That democracy is a bunch of unruly voices.
It's supposed to be.
It's supposed to be. There's a rough and tumble. And we want that and we need that. I'm talking about something that's a basic agreement, really, a kind of pre-contract to treat your adversary with respect, to treat your interlocutor as someone who has a point of view that's not insane or demented or evil. And that we can actually, if we don't agree, we can at least talk. This is the premise of democracy. It always has been.
Disagree without being disagreeable.
Yes, exactly.
So you want us to be more polite?
No.
No, you don't want us to be more polite.
No, it's very important to distinguish civility as I talk about it and politeness. Politeness belongs to the social realm. It's the how you behave at a dinner party and how you introduce people to each other, that kind of thing. It's on the side of manners and etiquette. Civility is a virtue of citizens. It's a political virtue that is aligned closely with things like respect and a willingness to engage. And so this is the thing, it's not just a holding back from your own violent tendencies, should you have them, not bopping somebody on the head. It actually means or entails a commitment to be engaged actively in political discourse.
Well, let me take this off the 30,000 feet look down and put it into the realm of reality. We have seen candidates for the Senate in this campaign who have talked about legitimate rape. We have seen candidates for Senate in this American campaign that have talked about it being God's will when a woman is raped and conceives a child.
Yeah.
Some would argue that a little incivility against those kind of folks wouldn't be a bad thing.
You know what? I don't think that's right either, because look at how those people were actually taken down a peg, and they were ridiculed, because those are ridiculous views. Those are not views that you should even take seriously. And insofar as you react violently, you engage a cycle. There's one key difference between the kind of argument I made for civility in 95 and the argument I'm making now. And that is the argument now is a negative argument, in the sense that it's to show why incivility is bad for everybody, as opposed to why civility is a good thing. Civility is a good thing. It's very hard to get people to agree because they push back like you're pushing back, which is great. But if you can demonstrate, which I think I can, that incivility is like a version of the so-called tragedy of the commons, where every cycle of incivility generates a bigger cycle back until sooner or later we all lose. And that's a self-defeating cycle, ultimately. So that's I think the powerful pragmatic argument. You can show that you won't win by being uncivil. You'll just make sure that everybody loses eventually.
But you've been beating this drum for almost 2 decades now, and you're not the only one, obviously. There's lots of people out there who say we need more of this in our public life, but we're getting worse. Why are we getting worse if there are increasing numbers of people who say we really need to get better at this?
Well, I think this, now you're talking about a multivalent causal story. You mentioned Twitter. I never want to be the anti-Twitter guy, but there are things that happen in our modes of communication that make certain things more likely and other things less likely. So to the extent that we speed up the cycle of communication, there are fewer and fewer things that can be said. The things that can be said come and go very quickly, and the kinds of commentary that fight for attention in this kind of marketplace of loudness or of novelty are going to be the ones that are most abrasive or most vivid. So that's just, this is part of how technology is changing over time. It's changing very quickly, and we tend, as human beings, we tend to be always behind the technology that we're using. There's a kind of lag, sort of a contrail of foolishness between the bleeding edge of our technology and where we are in our own minds. So in that space, there's a possibility for intervention for people like me to say, well, hang on a second, slow down from 140 characters every other minute and maybe read 10,000 words on why this is a good policy and that one's not. I realize that's unlikely, but we have to try, because otherwise we're just, going along with that same tide.
Let me circle back to the old fogeyism you talked about, because, there's plenty of people who think that there's really nothing new under the sun. Yes, we have Twitter and Facebook, which are new means of communicating our bloviations, if you like. But, Andrew Jackson's presidential bid in 1824 and 1828, he was called an adulterer, and his wife Rachel was called a bigamist, and one newspaper went so far as to call her a fat dumpling. Politics has, and we can look at the speeches in Congress, we can look at the speeches at the founding of Canada back in 1867. There's plenty of nasty stuff that went down.
Yeah.
So is anything really new here?
I think there are new things. That is good evidence, and there's lots more, as you say, of why you can't make a kind of progressivist or a decline argument here. But you have to make the arguments that are appropriate to the things that we want from political discourse at our moment. And we're talking about social media. There are some interesting studies that have just come out recently, last couple of years, that show that people who use social media a lot, particularly young people, demonstrate empathy deficits when they're tested. That's to say, they care less about other people the more they use these media.
How come?
The causes are a little bit unclear, but it seems to me that we could speculate that the more you are, as it were, tuned into the palm of your hand, the less you care about the world around you. You might think that that's communicating, but it's actually all about you. So there is a sort of a presupposition of narcissism, which is constantly reinforced by that focus on the palm. And I'm not just talking about people walking into me on the street. You probably had it happen to you because they're always looking down. But this kind of total interiorization of one's identity.
Sure.
And that's exactly what democracy can't function with.
We need more empathy in democracy.
We need more empathy. We need the basic idea that the other person is an entity worth caring about. Because absent that, we can't go on to talk about anything else. We would be where we are, in fact, already in some alleged democracies, trading taxes for services. That's a pure mechanism, a contract between individuals and some provider. But that's not what democracy is supposed to be. And if you ask people, increasingly, they will see it that way. And that, to me, is the most threatening trend of our own political moment, is that we have, as it were, allowed all of politics to be reduced to a series of transactions.
So let's spend our last few minutes here talking about what you would like us to do about all this, because obviously we're not going to be tweeting less, we're not going to be Facebooking less, we're not going to be watching less cable television and seeing fewer bloviators on the air. All of these things are going to get more and more and more. So you say we need to use our imagination. Like what?
Well, there are a couple of things I want to say. The imagination part is, that's how you cultivate empathy. You have to be able to imagine what it's like to be somebody else, even for a split second, in order to have that sense of connection with them. But more importantly, one of the things that philosophical reflection shows us is that our sense of identity is a lot more fragile and contingent than we usually think. That is, we really depend on other people to be ourselves. We need other people in order to be individuals in the first place. We tend to think it goes the other way. There's me, and then I might or might not reach out to you. But in fact, I can't be me unless you're here. And the more you reflect on that fact, the more I think you realize that this atomization is precisely that. It's not a democratization of discourse or communication. It's an atomization. We're alienating ourselves from each other. So that's cultivation of imagination through art and literature and philosophical reflection. But the other thing I think that's very important to say is that there are practical measures that this leads us to. The Citizens United decision in the U.S. Supreme Court made the current presidential election what it is. And when the spending finally stops tomorrow, or maybe later today, the billions of dollars that you need even to consider being president is one of the blackest marks on American history. When speech is converted into money, which is exactly what Citizens United did, it takes the speech of ordinary individual citizens and reduces them almost to nothing. That's a decision that has to be repealed, and that's a practical measure for that polity. Insofar as we watch our own conditions here in Ontario and in Ottawa, the prorogation of Parliament is an affront to the democratic process, and yet nobody seems upset about it. We need to be a lot more upset about that. And ultimately then, there's a kind of democracy here which is, I sometimes call it the gift economy of democracy, the parts that refuse to be reduced to transaction, the stuff that will not be bought or sold. And the more you emphasize that, I think, the more you can at least try to breathe life back into the body politic.
I compliment you for your consistency on this prorogation thing, because I knew a lot of university professors who were excoriating Stephen Harper for proroguing to avoid the noose, but have been really quiet since Dalton McGuinty did it. But you're not so quiet about that one.
No, I think that there's actually arguments that the McGuinty version is worse because he was trying to avoid a non-confidence motion. So no, I absolutely consistent on that point.
Okay. Mark Kingwell, it's good to see you again here at TVO.
Thanks, likewise.
Keep writing this stuff and we'll keep trying to improve the, now is it incivil or uncivil? Because I notice you say incivil in here.
Uncivil and incivility.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's one of the many new things I've learned having read this. Okay. Mark Kingwell, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.